The Kremlin has decided to go ahead and make it official. Putin is officially the winner of the Russian elections, garnering like 88% of the vote. But what I thought was more interesting is how this is being spun in Russian media. We're going to cover that, plus all the updates on the battlefield. I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's crack into it. Okay, so first off, looking at the control map, right, there hasn't actually been that significant of changes to the battlefield. Notably, you can see this small area of Verbova becoming contested, Russian forces making really small advances. I actually think that given that Ukraine is officially pivoting away from offensive actions, there's not much reason to continue to hold this territory where they attempted to make a breakthrough near Verbova. As we've talked about, right, these kind of salients aren't really sustainable on the battlefield. And frankly, these villages like Robtina, they just don't have any kind of larger strategic value in and of themselves. Their only value was when Ukrainian forces were attempting to penetrate Russian lines in this region. So I don't put a ton of stock in those changes. The only other battlefield notes is outside of Avdiivka near the town of Orlivka. Russian forces advancing. I mean, it's literally like maybe a dozen meters. You can see here is 100 meters. I think we're looking at maybe 100 meters of advance through this wood line. You can see they're changing a little bit the way they've tracked this control over this body of water, but that's just symbolic, right? Obviously, there's not Russian troops like swimming on buoys out here. So the only changes are just a few dozen meters of this forested area. But what's important to note is what's not happening, which is that Russia is still struggling to break through any of this defensive line, again, defined by the river and reservoir system that runs kind of north-south from Berdaichi down to Tonenke. So, again, the takeaway on the battlefield, Russia's not really doing a lot, right? We're seeing what looks more and more like repositioning. Now, if Putin gets to win his elections because he's rigged everything in his favor. It's easy, but real life isn't like that. If you wish you could rig things in your favor, I don't have a electoral fraudulent system to give you, but I can give you straight gum. Right? This is 90 milligrams caffeine in every piece, 0 sugar, and of course, you guys know that 90 milligrams is as much as an amp energy, as much as a Red Bull, but with none of the sugar. Plus, I know, guys, Red Bulls are like $4 at the gas station. I just checked the other day. So you definitely want to go to strikegum.com and pick some up, but we're also on Amazon now. So if you've got an Amazon account, you can go in. I'm going to link to them in the description and pick some up. And a huge thank you to the people that have left reviews. It really makes a huge difference for me, for us. You guys know that if you don't have reviews on Amazon, you might as well not be there. So I appreciate all you guys and everybody that's purchased from strikegum.com. Okay, so as we've talked about, more legitimate news sources. There's not really any single legitimate news source. There's no such thing as a fully unbiased news source. But those that you can more or less count on, like CBS News, of course, are reporting that Putin is hailing an election victory, but it's not really an election victory, right? There was never any doubt. He won a 5th term with a record number of votes, underlining the Russian leader's total control of the country's political system. Of course, he faced, as we point out, only token challengers, and any real opposition voices like Alexei Navalny, they're using the word harshly suppressed. They had him sent to Siberia where he died. So, of course, this makes Putin the longest-serving Russian leader in 200 years, and we know from his interview with Tucker Carlson that that's the scope of time that he thinks in, right? The reason that Putin went on a 30-minute Russian history lesson is because that was really relevant to him, right? As Carlson pointed out, it could have been filibustering, but it actually did give us some meaningful insight into how someone like Putin thinks. And this is how he's thinking now as he gets up in years and thinks about his status kind of going forward, his legacy. And he wants to be a Peter the Great level figure in Russian history. But he believes that he can't do that without being a conquering hero, right? And so he needs somewhere to conquer. That's why he's decided to do Ukraine. But worth noting that the Ukrainians seem to have other ideas. But what I thought was interesting and really worth looking at is not so much what we already know, right? We knew 4 days ago what the outcome of the elections were going to be, that they were going to be largely fraudulent. They weren't going to be real elections in a meaningful sense. But what does the Russian media landscape, how are they trying to spin this? And for that, we're going over to RT, right? RT is Russian state TV. And what's fascinating is that the front page doesn't actually talk about the electoral victory. I mean, imagine waking up after a U.S. election and not seeing the winner plastered all over the front page. It's pretty fascinating to me because for most other places, if there's a competitive election, you want to cover the outcome, right? Like, if for no other reason than to inform the public of who they're dealing with, right? Even if you went into Germany, right, not the United States, you would still see the outcome of the election on the front page because it really governs the direction of so much of the world. And yet, you could see it's actually buried right here. Putin scores historic win in Russian presidential election, official results. And literally, it has the same billing as actually which is ironic and almost certainly deliberate, the 10-year anniversary of the Russian annexation of Crimea. Excuse me, according to RT, it's return to Russia. So what I thought was interesting, of course, they put the bottom line up front. Putin reelected as Russia's president, right? Published by its Central Election Commission. Putin has claimed 88% of the vote. A record share of votes, of course, winning by a landslide, which, we can infer by the fact that Putin wants to be seen as extremely endorsed. That itself is sort of a sign of insecurity, right? It's like a short guy who wants to put on as much muscle mass as possible. You can literally use his desire to become more muscular as a proxy for how secure he's feeling in himself. Does that make sense? Apologies to all the short kings out there. But what I thought was interesting is that, of course, the opponents in the race were a Communist Party, New People Party, Liberal Democrats, right? All of which these are the names of parties that would sound like they were of different ideological ilks, but no, these are all handpicked. And Putin's sophisticated enough to understand that the parties have to at least sound different, not necessarily, even if they are all really controlled by Putin. Right? He was first elected. Putin, they point out, was elected in 2000, served 2 consecutive 4-year terms until 2008, then became prime minister under Dmitry Medvedev, and then he extended the term of president to 6 years, and then Putin came back, becoming head of state once again, getting re-elected in 2018, and then in 2020, Russia amended its constitution, nullifying Putin's previous terms, enabling him to run for office once again. So I thought that was really interesting. They also report a record high voter turnout, 74%. Right? The highest turnout, over 90%, was recorded in the Chechen Republic, a state known for its incredibly legitimate governing structure. And I point this out because, again, these numbers are significant as they are meant to create the illusion of a majority support for Putin. And some people undoubtedly do support Putin and his policies, but it's very, very, very rare in any electoral democracy to see a leader who leads their country into a beleaguered war become more popular, right? Bush kind of had this early in the post 9/11 era, but it really quickly fell off. 2 years later when he invaded Iraq, and by 2004, it became pretty apparent that the Iraq War was looking more and more like a debacle and a quagmire. And when you had that, right, Bush became very, very vulnerable electorally. In fact, he was one of the lowest rated presidents by the time he left office. So here's what I thought was interesting is RT's got some takeaways from Putin's victory speech. This is really interesting. This is maybe the best insight we can get into how Putin wants to frame what he is doing within the Russian state, right? He says that he dreamed of a strong, independent, and sovereign Russia, right? Notice what isn't there is free, right? Sovereign is usually refers to as not being able to be coerced by another country. Independent, meaning basically the same thing. And of course, strong. This is a classic authoritarian move where we Russians, even though you Russians are not free or independent, or like sovereign in terms of how you live your lives, Russia will be, right? The vote will allow us to all together, the Russian people, to achieve these goals. Right? Again, the classic Vladimir Putin, believed to be one of the richest people to ever exist in history, given his total control over the Russian state apparatus, saying that you and me, the Russian people, are going to achieve things, right? You, the Russian conscripts drafted out of a Siberian prison, and me, the mega multi-deca billionaire, we're going to work together to achieve something. Pretty cringe, right? And don't get me wrong, U.S. politicians, they are just as guilty of it, right? When you have, a billionaire like Trump or a multi-hundred millionaire like Nancy Pelosi tell us how we Americans are going to work together. You're like, you haven't worked for anything a day in your life, right? What I found fascinating is Putin says, quote, due to the current situation, which he refuses to call a war, due to the fact that we have to literally defend the interests of our citizens, which is, okay, that's something that all governments do. They literally are supposed to defend the interest of our citizens. Our people with weapons in our hands to create a future for the full-fledged, sovereign, secure development of the Russian Federation, our homeland, which is kind of an interesting and oblique way of referring to the fact that Russia has been on a campaign to Russify the occupied regions of Ukraine. They've been handing out passports, and that is not an accident, right? It enables him to say things like that and to frame things in this way, to refer to Ukrainians as our citizens. Remember, they weren't Russian citizens until Russia invaded and started handing out passports. They were doing it a little bit in the separatist Donbas region, but this is a standard Russian playbook, the Russification of these occupied regions. Putin also notes that we have a lot of tasks ahead of us. And when we are united, no one can intimidate or suppress us. No one succeeded at this before. It did not happen now and will never occur in the future. Okay, this is just like generic. This sounds like pretty generic. But it is an oblique reference to likely NATO efforts who say that, listen, you can't invade your neighbor's guy. You can't go invading other sovereign countries. He describes this as intimidation, which it was kind of meant to be. We were trying to tell him, like, listen, dude, if you do this, NATO's going to come back up their friends, right? And of course, no one can suppress us. Vaguely true, though, man, I've seen some Ukrainians rocking 240 Bravos that definitely appear to suppress the Russians. And of course, he talks about a development agenda. And he talks about the developing and strengthening of the motherland. This is interesting. This is actually interesting because we're going to look in a second at the Russian official media outlets' position on Crimea, and development is a huge point here. So I think Putin is trying to thread the needle where he's both acknowledging that they're in the middle of a war that's economically tough on Russia, but Russia has done something that very few people have expected, and that is sustain economic growth. And so the fact that Putin is trying to say, listen, we're going to win this war, and also we're going to develop the country domestically, is a pretty bold promise for him to make. What I thought was fascinating, though, is also Putin has started to put out something that he calls a cordon sanitaire. This is a translation of a quarantine. Quarantine, right, is a term that, so a blockade is considered a act of war. So it's very careful when leaders instead use words like quarantine. It is to hide the fact that it's another act of war. And don't get me wrong, this quarantine was a term also used by the U.S. right in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Though the U.S. would tell you it wasn't a true blockade because they allowed food and non-military equipment to pass, which again is still an act of war, right? And of course, right, Putin acknowledged that the enemy, Ukrainians, have deployed a group of about 5,000 people. Their losses are about 40%. Not clear that that's the case. And those who crawled into our territory were destroyed almost 100%. Okay, this is literally incongruent. If the group is about 40% and almost 100% were destroyed, and the enemy likes a meat grinder, even if we benefit from it. Not clear what the benefit is of having another foreign entity invade your territory, but that's, well, unfortunately, Russia can't. If Russia acknowledges that it's just bad and wrong to invade your neighbors, well, even Russian voters might be stuck to having to square that circle. Of course, the classic Putin rolling out a talking point that he has been sort of stuck with since the war started, which is comparing the Ukrainians to the elements of the German party that governed the country from 1939 to 1945. Please don't demonetize me, YouTube. So, again, what I find fascinating is he definitely is acknowledging the struggles behind the Ukraine conflict, right, and the state of Russia, but he's also trying to thread it as like a total victory. There's not a lot of substance here, but it does reflect the fact that I think he himself knows that this is his largest liability politically. And he also acknowledges that the Ukrainian incursion into Russia is a huge issue for him. Okay, so before we get out of here, right, I just want to take a look at one last thing, and that is the convenient timing. Putin's electoral victory coincides to the day with a decade since Crimea was reunified with Russia. This is from the Russian state news agency. Here's what I found fascinating, is that in terms of discussing what has happened in Crimea, there's no acknowledgement that they use the word reunified with Russia. There's no acknowledgement that this used to be a part of Ukraine. There's no acknowledgement about the anything about the political situation. Instead, it focuses entirely on economic development, which is fascinating, right? They say that according to Russian government statistics, the gross regional product of the Republic of Crimea increased by 3.5 times, right? With increased investment capital surging 8 times, right? They acknowledge that rail and bus traffic to Crimea was halted after the reunification with Russia on the initiative of Ukraine, i.e. Ukraine bombed it. Right. And of course, there's a discussion of highways and airports and energy and a free economic zone and tourism. More than 70 hotels were built and 600 renovated in the peninsula since 2014. That's because, of course, it is a popular vacation site for Russians. And that's basically, but what's interesting is what isn't talked about. And that is anything about the political situation within Crimea, any acknowledgement of Ukrainian claims on the territory, and even anything about like citizenry or freedoms or, usually, right, you may notice that according to the official narrative, right, if Ukraine is a bunch of is analogous to the German authoritarian party from the 30s, if that's true, then why wouldn't Russia talk about how nice it must be for the Crimeans to live in relative freedom, right? They got out from a dangerously oppressive regime, right? But they don't talk about that. All they talk about is more hotels and better trade and traffic, which is pretty weird, right? Well, we know why. It's because that thing is that claim about the Ukrainians being secret Germans is just nonsense. It's a total fiction, and even the Russians seem to acknowledge that it's just made up. Anyway, guys, that's all I had. Thanks to Colonel Tier members. Hit like and subscribe on the video. Tell the YouTube algorithm that I make good content, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.